Mage, Warrior, Rogue, the three classes of Dragon Age are back in the Veilguard, but they are vastly different to the previous games with new abilities, skill trees, weapons, specializations, and more. So which class is right for you? Let's go. Let me know in the comments which of these classes you're picking. We'll start with the Rogue. Now, the Rogue uses 2 swords and a bow, and different to the other classes, the Rogue has access to both of these weapons at all times. The bow acts as their ranged weapon on the ranged button, and the 2 swords is like their basic attacks that you'll have light and heavy attacks and charge attacks, sprint attacks, all that stuff with. Now, the Rogue's class resource is called Momentum, which is mostly gained by dodging attacks and parrying successfully. Something else that's unique to the Rogue is if you perfect dodge an attack, you'll sort of turn into that little smoke mist thing for a brief period of time. Another thing unique to the Rogues is that they can't block. So with the Warrior who has a shield, you can pull up that shield and just block damage. Same with the Mage with the staff, they can have like a magical like shield bubble around them to just simply block damage. The Rogue can only deflect. So you'll be wanting to dodge attacks and parry attacks using that deflect and timing those things a little bit more consistently compared to the other classes. So it might be a little bit more finesse based than say the other 2 classes if you want to think about it that way. Now, before we get into the specializations for the Rogue, I wanted to touch on the fact that I have a video for all 3 classes that goes over every single ability, in-depth look at the skill tree, the companions, all the different things you need to know about that specific class. It's probably the most comprehensive breakdown of the classes prior to the launch of the game. So I would highly recommend you go and watch those videos if you want to learn a bit more about one of these classes or all of the classes that you hear about today. So we'll start with the Duelist specialization. Now, this is themed after the Antivan Crows, and the Duelist specializes on using those blades to punish enemies with devastating melee blows that primarily deal necrotic damage. The ultimate ability for this specialization is the Murder of Crows, which deals straight necrotic damage. You use your advanced agility to cut down enemies foolish enough to challenge an Antivan Crow. Your enemies will think you have wings as you leap rapidly between nearby targets, dealing damage with each strike. The final leap deals significant damage to any enemies near the strike zone, and 1,000 strikes is a unique ability here that also does necrotic damage, and it does come at 2 cost. Assume a duelist pose, then rapidly slice and dice your opponent, dealing damage up to 16 times with an especially devastating final blow. So the main focus here is going to be on melee damage. So if that's something that you like with the Rogue being up close and personal, dodging attacks, parrying attacks, then this is definitely the specialization you'll probably want to go. The Saboteur, however, deploys explosives and turrets that devastate enemies. Now, this is a trap and turret focused specialization, specifically leaning into these different tools that you can then use for abilities. The ultimate ability here is Fortune's Fury, which is a physical damage ability to embrace your fury, equipping a powerful expendable weapon to bombard enemies. Now, you fire a rapid stream of projectiles and then you toss that weapon to deal additional damage, and you can end the attack early if you do choose to. Now, the ability here is Fortune's Turret, which is another duration tool that is also dealing physical damage. Now, you'll just simply throw down a mechanized turret that targets the closest enemy and peppers them with projectiles. When spent, the device explodes, dealing heavy damage to anything within its range. On your way to this specialization, you will gain other skills and traps that you'll be able to use as part of a Saboteur build, which I did actually get to play during my preview. I did really like this turret. It does make such a difference, especially in boss fights. You can pop this turret down and then focus on the boss while still peppering, dealing sort of damage over time. It is quite a fun specialization if you can set up the battlefield in a really specific way. The Veil Ranger, however, focuses on the last part of the Rogue's kit, being the bow. This is a ranged focus specialization that uses long range shots and pinpoint accuracy. The ultimate ability here is Twin Gifts of Arlathan, which does electricity damage. Discovering bizarre relics means Veil jumpers toy with more experimental approaches to combat, throw 2 entangled relic fragments that rapidly bounce between targets, and the ability here is Storm's Path, which is an area of effect electricity ability that detonates overwhelmed. A Veil jumper makes their own path. It just requires some creativity, or a lot. Fire a massive blast from your bow, damaging all enemies in the way. So if you like the bow focus of this kit, this is definitely the specialization that you'll go with. The thing to note here is that this is all ranged focus, and you will still have access to your swords, however, because you will always have them if you do choose to use those basic and heavy attack combinations. You only really get that bow on like the ranged attack is where you'll actually be able to use it, but then all of these abilities and like the ultimate ability focus on that, and also the minor skills in this line reduce the cooldown on your bow and like your amount of arrows, so you'll be able to lean into that much more efficiently than the other specializations. Now, as a rogue, you can apply Weakened with Static Strikes and Reeling Bolt, which are mostly ranged skills, and you can also apply Sundered with Toxic Dash or Explosive Daggers, which are mostly melee skills. But you can only detonate Overwhelmed with skills like Explosive Trap, Pilfer, and Storm's Path, which is that Veil Ranger skill we just touched on. The reason I bring this up is because you want to be thinking about your companion pairings, making sure that you can detonate the primers that your companions are bringing up, plus you actually applying something that then your companions can actually detonate. Now, the best pairing for a rogue is a warrior, that being either Davron or Tash here, because they can both apply Overwhelmed and then they can detonate Weakness, which is the other side of what you can apply as a rogue. Nev, Balara, and Emric can all detonate the Sundered effect that you can apply with those melee skills, Toxic Dash and Explosive Daggers. So as a rogue, you want to be thinking about whether you're focusing on those ranged skills and applying Weakened to then be able to detonate it with something like Davron or Tash, or if you are focusing on the melee skills and applying Sundered to detonate that with Neve, Balara, or Emric. The warrior class has two different weapon options. Firstly, you have a sword and a shield, and you've also got a two-handed hammer or maul. Now, I know it's a massive talking point in the community about whether two-handed swords are a thing. Personally, I didn't see one during the preview session. Maybe there is, and we just haven't seen them yet. Like, we'll have to wait, obviously, for the game to come out, but potentially there is maybe some sort of unique two-handed sword or something. I don't know. Haven't seen one personally. We'll just have to wait for the game to come out. But the warrior class uses a rage mechanic. Now, they build rage by taking and dealing damage, and unique to the warrior is that weapon swapping that we were talking about, how they can freely swap between the weapon by pressing down on the D-pad, and you can also defend by holding that shield when you're in that sword and board configuration. However, when you're in the two-handed configuration, you'll actually be able to deflect. Now, a core part of the warrior's kit is about applying stagger. Now, stagger is that purple bar that all enemies have. When you build that up, and you can then initiate like a takedown to finish that enemy as well. The warrior's overall playstyle is a little slower than the other classes, where you're really focusing here on swinging massive weapons or, throwing your shield to deal strong amounts of damage, but without actually that quick sort of agile aspects of some of the other kits. You still can dodge and roll and do all those things, but you'll really be focusing on tanking a lot of that damage because you want to take those hits, right, to build up that rage so you can then dump that into your abilities. The specializations for the warrior here is the Reaper. To steal life and risk death to gain incredible unnatural abilities, the Reaper wields necrotic damage to siphon enemy health to restore their own. The ultimate ability here is Spirit Storm, which is a necrotic skill to call upon the Morn Watcher's cult knowledge to unleash a necrotic storm. A whirlwind moves towards your target, inflicting multiple hits and applying siphon to enemies, and the ability here is Reaper, which is a massive ethereal scythe that slashes and slices your enemies. Now, this does apply the siphoned effect. Now, what siphon does is it does necrotic damage over time to the target, but it does restore a portion of your health as well. So as a Reaper, you want to be trying to siphon enemies and then tank that damage, right? We talked about not dodging here. You want to be standing there, having them hit you to restore that rage aspect, but then you'll be getting that healing over time effect from siphoning it off the enemies. As the Slayer specialization, you'll be wielding massive punishing weapons while rushing enemies to deal devastating blows. Now, this is focused on those two-handed weapons we were talking about, dealing massive amounts of stagger and physical damage with the ultimate ability for Gold and Glory, which is a physical damage ability. That Glory favors the bold, leap into the fray and deals very high stagger to enemies within range. And then the ability here is Heroic Leap, which is a strike or a smash ability as you slam yourself into the ground, which also is physical damage, and it detonates Weaken to leap forward and deal heavy damage to any nearby enemies, dealing high amounts of stagger, and is highly likely to disrupt enemies. So if you like that more, say, traditional warrior play with like a two-handed weapon and you want to like leap down into the fray or like charge into enemies, the Slayer is the specialization for you. The Champion is a Grey Warden themed specialization that uses the shield and the sword primarily to protect their allies and unleash damage with fire. The ultimate ability here is Warden's Fire, which, you guessed it, deals fire damage to unleash a barrage of strikes with the burning strength that resides within every Grey Warden, and it does apply burning to enemies. And the ability is called Blightbane, which is an area of effect projectile ability that does fire damage, and it does also cost 2 ticks of your rage, and this does detonate Weakened to throw a Warden Siege Bomb that bursts into clusters of explosives after a short time, and each explosive is capable of applying burning to enemies in a small radius. So if you like more of maybe a traditional sword and shield user, applying fire damage and burning to enemies, especially fighting against Darkspawn, because Darkspawn are weak to fire, then the champion is definitely going to be a fantastic specialization for you. And in terms of your companion pairings here, as a warrior rook, you'll be able to apply Sundered with Bloody Advance, Overwhelmed with Titan Stomp and Grappling Spear, and then you'll also be able to detonate Weakened with a bunch of skills from Driving Kick to Groundbreaker to Reaper to Heroic Leap and Blightbane. To pair this rook with companions, you'll mostly want to pair with mages, as mages can apply Weakened, say Nev, Balara and Emmerich, and they can also detonate the Sundered effect that you can apply with Bloody Advance. Harding and Lucanus are also good combinations here, as they can both detonate the Overwhelmed effect that you can apply with Titan Stomp and Grappling Spear. So mostly you're looking at the mage companions and the rogue companions for a combination to combine with a warrior rook type. Lastly, we have a mage. Now the mage uses either a staff for ranged combat or a mage knife, which is basically just a dagger, and orb combo, and you can freely switch between them like the warrior can by pressing down on the D-pad. The dagger and orb is mostly melee focused, however both weapon types have a ranged attack, which is like a beam, a charged beam that you can then use, which is obviously best to take off the blue, the shield health bars that you see on enemies. The mage class resource is mana. Now this does generate passively over time. This is much easier to generate compared to the warrior that needs to deal damage or take damage, or the rogue that needs to dodge attacks or parry successfully. The mage also has access to being able to block by holding the block button with the two-handed staff. You see like a magical shield around them, but then when you're using the mage knife and the orb, you have access to the deflect, similar to say, a rogue or the two-handed warrior that has access to deflecting. While using your mage knife and orb, you also have access to arcane marks. Now hitting enemies with your orb 3 times adds an arcane bomb, and then hitting an enemy with a heavy attack consumes the arcane bomb, dealing massive damage. So when thinking about the mage here, there's a lot of flexibility in their overall kit, but for the most part here, you'll be doing some sort of elemental damage, either with the mage knife and orb or with the staff, and then obviously with your abilities, and then specializing in one of those types of damage. The first specialization here is Deathcaller. This is a Mournwatch themed specialization that focuses on necrotic damage. The ultimate ability here is called Crypt's Herald. This deals necrotic damage. Be like death, drawing in the power of the Fade and surrounding yourself with a necrotic storm. This slowly absorbs life from all nearby enemies before ending in a punishing burst, causing massive damage. And the ability here is called Spirit Bomb. Drain the life out of your enemies, then throw it back at them in an explosion of necrotic damage. This does apply siphoned and deals damage each second you are connected to a target before a final blast deals bonus damage that intensifies the longer the target has been exposed to it. This does also detonate Sundered. So if you're thinking about maybe playing in a little bit of that melee range, or you're not totally sure if you want to be melee or range, this is a good specialization because you can apply that siphon effect to get some of that health back, as mages are always squishy in game, so you get a little bit of healing over time. You can also deal some really solid necrotic damage and damage over time effects by both of these different skills. The Evoker freezes enemies in their tracks, then summons the deepest cold to tear them apart. Now the Evoker wields cold damage primarily, as well as some area manipulation magic to pull enemies in close, and then follow up with these big hits of cold damage to freeze them in place. The ultimate ability, Vortex of Shadow, deals cold damage to concentrate entropic energy on a single point until it reaches critical levels, creating a vortex. The vortex appears in front of you, dealing damage each second while pulling enemies towards its center. And the ability Entropic Sphere applies the weakened status effect and also does cold damage over time. Launch a sphere of entropic energy that damages all enemies in its path before exploding in a punishing final blast. Now this is definitely a range focused specialization. You'll be using a lot more of that staff, freezing enemies in place, also to keep them away from you because you don't want them to be attacking you in melee range. So you will want to be thinking about combining this with companions when we start talking about that can then deal that follow-up in melee range. The Spellblade, however, will see you in close quarters, as this is a electricity focused, melee focused mage that uses a lot of electricity damage and the mage knife and orb to slay their enemies. The ultimate ability here is Thunderous End, which is an electricity based ability to conjure a deadly avatar of the storm to seek vengeance on your enemies. This deals heavy damage and applies 2 stacks of shock to enemies within a large radius. Void Blade is the ability. This is an electricity ability that detonates sundered. By harnessing the agility of the Antivan crows, dash forward in a flash of dark energy before landing a deadly slash that explodes a moment later, and this deals damage twice. So if you do like the idea of playing as a mage but you don't like to use a staff, then this is definitely the specialization for you, leaning into that electricity damage, applying a lot of those arcane marks to then detonate them on enemies like we were talking about earlier. Now, companion pairings here, as a mage rook, you can apply Overwhelm with Chain Lightning and Storm Surge. You can apply Weakened with Ice Blast, Corrupted Ground, and Entropic Sphere, as well as detonate Sundered with Dark Squall, Meteor, Spirit Bomb, and Void Blade. The best companion pairings are Harding and Lucanus, the rogue companions, because they can both apply the Sundered effect that you can detonate, as well as detonate the Overwhelmed effect that you can apply with Chain Lightning and Storm Surge. You've also got some connectivity with the warriors, both Davron and Tosh, because they can detonate Weakened, which you can apply with Ice Blast, Corrupted Ground, and Entropic Sphere, which is especially useful for a range focus evoker that gets access to Extrophic Fear. You want to have a warrior in that close range to tank some of that damage for you. But let me know in the comments which of the 3 classes you are picking and potentially what specialization you're going to go. I'd love to hear about your rook below. But thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.